So without any further ado, I want to bring Dr. Tolson back on to introduce our new panel members. We already have the Deputy Assistant Secretary from the Department of Education, Dr. Michael Wooten. Let's give him a round of applause and give an applause to Secretary DeVos, quite frankly, for tapping him to come. And it definitely demonstrates her appreciation for this message. We were talking about how Dr. Leonard Haynes, who many of you all may also know, was instrumental in our engagement, and so we're very grateful to the outstanding team the President has over there at the Department of Education. In addition, we have, as was mentioned before, our honorable, esteemed voice for educators here in the District of Columbia and in fact across the country, and that is the President of the Washington Teachers Union, Elizabeth, I said again, Elizabeth, and not to be mistaken with Liz, Elizabeth Davis. So let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you. How are you? Pleasure meeting.
We also have Dr. Charles Sutton, a representative from the president of Lincoln University, one of the outstanding institutions of education, founded in 1854 as one of the first African-American institutions of higher education here in this country, and very grateful for his comments. So we're going to get started, and again, Dr. Tolson, let's bring again a round of applause for Dr. Tolson.
Okay, well, in the interest of time, we're going to dive right in. We've already heard from industry, the business leaders. So now we want to take it to education, which is where we actually started. So we have a very capable panel who's already been introduced. So we'll follow the order that's on the agenda and start with Dr. Michael Wooten to tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing and how that ties into this topic of infrastructure, building infrastructure workforce.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. I don't know if I need to mic up. Either I need to mic up or man up, one of the two. I was a Marine, so I should be able to project. Thank you again for the opportunity to come here, and you are correct. This has been a priority for leadership in the Department of Education. You mentioned a great mentor of mine. Day one, I checked in the same day as Dr. Leonard Haynes, and within my first hour, I said, that's my mentor. He's a solid person to follow, and I think his association brings great credibility to those who work with him. So again, thank you for this opportunity. So to talk a little bit about what I do, where my focus is, presently I wear three hats. In the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education, that title denotes two areas merged together: career technical education and adult education. And in that office, presently I wear three hats. I serve as the Acting Assistant Secretary for Career, Technical, and Adult Education, because one has not been named and confirmed by the Senate yet. I serve as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Career, Technical, and Adult Education. That is the position to which I have been appointed. And then thirdly, I serve as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Management. So juggling those three hats is a bit of a challenge, but I won't complain because it's an intense labor, but it's an intense labor of love. So what do I do? Let's talk about things that I generally focus on, and I know when I'm called to address American citizens, when I'm called to address different groups that are concerned with career and technical education, they want to hear, there's at least one thing they want to hear from me, and that's what's going on in the world of apprenticeships. So I want to talk about that in the middle, and briefly. I'm looking at rethinking schools, rethinking how we do career technical education, particularly looking at ways to improve the quality and number, or I should say expand the number of qualified teachers in career technical education. So that's one of the main things that I'm concerned with in the world of career technical education, and certainly looking at ways of expanding it and getting the word out to people about the wonderful opportunities that one can get going through career technical education as opposed to just one pathway, and that would be the traditional pathway of going to 4 years of college. Another area, obviously, is apprenticeships. And presently I have the honor of serving as a co-chair on the subcommittee for education and credentialing, which is one of the 4 subcommittees to the President's Task Force on Apprenticeship Expansion. And there we're looking at rolling out additional, in large measure, additional apprenticeship methods as opposed to just the registered apprenticeship program that's long been around to support those time-honored building trades of masonry, carpentry, electronics, and electrician and plumbing. In addition to that, we're looking at registered apprenticeships, or rather industry-recognized apprenticeships in more expansive areas to include more modern, high-tech fields such as the digital economy and health information. Thirdly, another thing I like to talk to people about is just the changing nature of work and raising the question of how we educate people appropriately for that changing nature of work. And when I have that conversation, yes, I'm talking about the gig economy. I'm talking about, specifically, I'm talking about the ways that more and more people, particularly millennials at the younger end and the silent generation at the older end, the ways more people will decide that they want to work, they want to earn a living. They will commission work for themselves. Another way of saying gig, they will get a gig, or they will commission work for themselves. They will have projects, and they will use those projects to bring in earnings. They will serve as their own CEOs and commission projects for themselves and have a portfolio. More and more people will be doing that. It's one of the answers. We have to wait carefully, but it is one of the answers to a question that was raised on the last panel, the gig economy. So those are the 3 things I generally want to let people know are on my mind. And thank you. Hopefully I didn't take up too much time.
Yeah, we have some follow-ups for you. Thank you. Dr. Charles Sutton.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'm Dr. Chao Sutton from Lincoln University, and just one point of clarification, Lincoln were actually the first HBCU, not one of, but the first. I just you have to put that out there.
Disappointed if you didn't do that.
So really, these I want to talk a little bit about what's happening at Lincoln University, because really these are some exciting times to be at Lincoln, because we have a new president in Dr. Brenda A. Allen. We have a new provost in Dr. Patricia Ramsey, and with that comes a new vision. And we just went through the process of developing a new strategic plan. And the interesting thing about it is being here, and I'm really grateful for being here, because hearing this discussion and hearing the previous panel, it really lets me know that we're on the right track at Lincoln in terms of what it is that we're doing. So with the new strategic plan, we sort of, it focuses on skill development for the 21st century economy. One of the things that we recognize is that this particular economy is global, is dynamic, and it's knowledge-based. So we recognize that the changes and the shifts in industry and in the economy is largely fueled by rapid changes in science and technology. The world is experiencing unprecedented levels of global competition. So we asked ourselves, how can our students compete? So one of the things that we figured is that we needed to redouble our efforts and hone our students' intellectual and interpersonal skills towards producing graduates that can tool and retool themselves as needed. The ability to adapt and change in changing times. When we looked at the top jobs, we asked ourselves what majors are needed for this. What skills do our students need? We definitely recognize that that they have to be strong in written and oral communication skills, critical thinking, quantitative literacy, scientific literacy, information literacy. And so then we asked ourselves, how do we impart these skills to our students? Well, we thought about implementing high impact pedagogy. So what does that mean? Looking at instructional approaches that impact learning outcomes and student success. So some of the things that we're going to begin to implement are first-year seminars, writing intensive courses, collaborative assignments and projects, community-based learning, service learning, capstone courses and projects. But then the two things that I'm particularly excited about, and which impacts my office, is the ability to get our students internships and to conduct undergraduate research. That's very important. And so how do we encourage this? How do we accomplish this? Simply by encouraging high rates of faculty-student interaction, as well as high rates of student engagement. And a little bit later on, perhaps if I can talk about our algebra project, I'll help you understand what it is that we mean. So the educational philosophy at Lincoln that's being adapted at Lincoln University right now is designed to accomplish three main goals. Student development, students develop broad and specific content knowledge. Students develop intellectual and interpersonal skills that transfer across career and personal contexts. And finally, students are provided with opportunities to engage important questions within the disciplines and the community and the surrounding community or their communities at home and in society at large. So this is the same goal across all disciplines, from A to Z, from art to zoology. And so I can talk a little bit more specific about the projects that our students are engaged in, some of the research projects that they're engaged in with faculty a little bit later on.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Elizabeth Davis.
Thank you. I see why Lincoln is leading the way. And I hope that the algebra project is with Bob Moses.
Yes, it is.
And ours is too. Thank you very much. Happy to hear it. I'm Elizabeth Davis. Liz is for my friends and family only. So my mom gave me Elizabeth, so I'm going to stick with it. I'm a 40-year teacher in D.C. public schools, 9 of them over the course of 44 years. I was assigned to the first school in D.C., Jefferson Junior High School, by a former superintendent, Carl Hansen. I don't know if any of you remember Hansen versus Henson. He was my professor at American U. I was an engineering student. He convinced me to try teaching for 1 year to pay off my student loans. And of course, I took the offer and never looked back. I have been offered positions in other administrative levels, not interested, because the classroom is where I love, still do, because it has basically been another type of training for me as a teacher, learning from my students in 9 schools across the district. An award-winning teacher, published in 3 books, writing about how I taught my students to write, love writing, and also learn CTE. My background is in CTE, by the way. I began my career at Jefferson as a teacher of drafting. I was asked to design the curriculum for junior high schools, which I did. And of course, the very first day I arrived at the school for my interview, I was informed by the principal, who was a male, African-American male, who told me, I want a man. And I need a male teacher to handle the boys. Now, that was my first experience as a teacher in DC public schools the first day. But it was not my first experience with discrimination. I actually attended 3 years in a segregated school district in the South. My mother moved here to Washington to get away from that. And of course, I was no newcomer to the issue of civil rights. So I had some very strong genes regarding standing up for self. And I filed a Title IX sex discrimination complaint the very next day and was returned back to Jefferson Junior High School, where I taught for 5 years. The girls at that school were basically relegated to taking courses that were traditionally developed for boys. So at the beginning of the second semester, I had to file the same complaint on behalf of all females at Jefferson who were denied access into the traditionally courses for boys, such as woodworking, graphic arts, the whole 9 yards, construction and manufacturing. That didn't set well with the principal, however, it worked for me, because that was a signal to me that I had a responsibility as a teacher to do more than simply teach the content to my students. The predominance of students at Jefferson at that time were 99% African-American students. Many of them came from actually low-income communities. So I felt the need to not only teach my students how to navigate a system that was not leveled, a level playing field for them, but also to teach them the content. And of course, so that just to give you some background on my career as a teacher, even before becoming the leader of the teachers union, because that experience as a teacher shaped who I became as a teacher, and also who I am as a leader of the teachers union. Focusing on social issues that impact teaching and learning has got to be a part of the equation. And I shared with the moderator earlier my connection to Howard University School of Education when I joined the writing project in 1995, because I realized my students lacked skills in writing. I wanted to teach those skills as a part of my curriculum, and I joined the writing project for that purpose. Since that time, CTE has been a focus of mine. I've taught computer-aided design. The last school I was assigned by Michelle Rhee in 2007. That was the Architecture and Construction Engineering High School in Ward 5, Phelps. I requested that transfer when Chancellor Rhee invited me to her office to discuss an op-ed that I had written to the Washington Post about her lack of having a school reform plan. So we had a discussion about the need to, first of all, focus more attention on CTE. Secondly, focus on the professional learning that teachers in CTE programs needed. Thirdly, to focus on the need to integrate CTE at the early grades, not at the junior high, middle school, education campus, and high school level, but at the very early stages. And that is happening in some school districts, where students at a very young age are learning skills that will help them in math, science, engineering, and technology. That's one of the reasons why we have so many students that do not have access to the resources and skills or curriculum that some students have. So access to opportunities is one of the areas of focus that we have a tremendous amount of work to do on. I listened to panelists on the first panel talk about all of the opportunities that are now and coming. When I heard the gentleman talk about the grid in DC, the jobs that will be available in 2023 and beyond, and the jobs that will be subcontracted out. And I had to think about all of the black and brown boys and girls I drive past every day who are standing on corners, who do not have any knowledge of that, who do not have any access, any pathway opportunities to those jobs, and how those jobs end up being basically subcontracted outside of the borders of DC, when many of our residents, many of our youth are basically ignored, mainly because we want to say, well, they're not prepared. Why aren't they? And one of the things that I explored deeply in the writing project was, when we explore a problem, or when we identify a problem, let's not focus on the symptoms, let's focus on the why. The bottom line, why is it that we have so many students, so many people who are underrepresented in STEM? Why are they not? When we talk about the pathways, the education, the curriculum, the professional development, the training for teachers, the course offerings in schools, and that varies from ward to ward and zip code to zip code based on which children are being served. We have a dual school system in DC. I know because I've taught in both. And we've got to address that realistically and honestly. That conversation has been going on in the 40 years I've taught in DC public schools, and we are still having it. The inequities that still exist in our schools that deny access to girls, brown and black boys and girls in STEM, the fact that physics, trigonometry, calculus are not offered in certain schools, AP courses are not offered in certain schools, electives are not offered in certain schools.
Yeah, I want to get to some follow-up questions, but thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
You gave lots and lots of food for thought. Starting off with Michael, one of the things, and I've been given a note, we have to end this in 10 minutes, so you all have 3 minutes apiece for these responses.
Okay.
But how are you all connecting balancing technical education with these trends in automation? And because there's a lot of studies that are showing that a lot of skills that we're teaching now will be obsolete in the foreseeable future. So how do we stay in the step ahead when we advance technical education when so many of these jobs are being automated?
I think that's a great question, particularly since you framed it this way. So many, excuse me, so many of the jobs will change. And in fact, you've probably all heard this before, that a entering freshman will, when he or she graduates, there will be jobs that did not exist when they first started school. It's a moving target. You have to go after some of the competencies that matter across the board. My esteemed colleague mentioned her work repeatedly on writing, and I will tell you, That is one of the most valuable skills that you can have. Is not just the communication piece, but through writing, oftentimes we think out what the process and the problems and the issues are. And we become critical thinkers because we write.
Absolutely.
That's so important. And I'm glad she said that. I'm also glad that she talked about her work in the district, because before coming here, I'm old enough that I've been in a lot of jobs and I don't tend to keep more than 1 year, but before coming here, I was the Deputy Chief Procurement Officer for the District of Columbia. I was writing contracts, my people were writing contracts that, yes, we're buying labor for the district, and that labor was being harvested from outside of the district borders, just like she said. She's absolutely right. So, but this is the first time I've had the pleasure of sitting down with somebody who's actually doing some things that can chip away at that erosion of opportunity from the district. So, to wrap up the answer to that question, understanding what competencies are going to matter no matter where you go, no matter what the jobs are, no matter what the opportunities are. That's one thing, and one of them is writing. Another thing is understanding that for most of the jobs that we have, they are process oriented. So as soon as somebody learns how to follow processes, they become value added to that organization. And if they understand that, when they pick up and go to the new place, they need to be asking themselves, what are the processes here? What are the rules and tools? And in fact, before I was the Deputy Chief Procurement Officer, I was the Chief Learning Officer for that same office, and I had to do the certification for DC procurement folks. And I made sure that I looked at 3 buckets of competencies: process competencies, critical thinking competencies in the middle, and then leadership competencies on the top. So there's some common frameworks, I think, that we start to understand that will matter and be helpful no matter what happens to the moving target of employment opportunities.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. Charles, you talked about your strategic plan at Lincoln University, and you talked about it in context of global education and innovating the curriculum. One of the things that I observed when I was executive director of the White House Mission 1 HBCUs is that HBCUs are moving at widely different levels and pace. If we just look at Carnegie classifications, we've had about 20 HBCUs who advanced in their Carnegie classification over the last 10 years. But we've also had about 15 that have gone down in the classification. How do we form more stronger networks between HBCUs so that we're not just having 100 strategic plans with variable success, but have more uniformity and more collaboration between institutions so that we can all grow together?
Well, I think it starts with the conversation. I think it starts with the conversation about, what is the end goal, and if there's any sort of commonalities amongst these universities whereby we can come together and develop, if you will, sort of like an overall strategic plan to move these organizations forward. Because again, I've read reports after reports of saying maybe like 10 or 15 years from now there might only be like 30 HBCUs. Because of this, I think that one of the things that we have to do is look at the market, understand the changes, understand the things that are happening, and again, like I said, have conversations, have dialogue about how we can perhaps develop a larger strategic plan about us moving forward as HBCUs.
Thank you. Very concise, clean, and crisp answer. Elizabeth, in our last 3 minutes, one of the things that I was most moved about what you said, and honestly, I could listen to you for about an hour because you were telling some very compelling things. But one of the things I was moved by was when you talked about the lawsuit that you initiated on behalf of your students. And I thought about one of my teachers when I was in high school, Mr. Jacobs, who fought hard for physics to come to my school. We didn't have physics. LSU, the school that I ended up graduating from, required physics. So I was at one of those schools that denied me the opportunity to go to my state's flagship institution. So he got it in the school for a window of opportunity. I took it, went to LSU, graduated in 4 years, but they actually took it away 2 years later. And he ended up in a bitter battle that he ultimately lost. He ended up leaving the school. But I think about if there were more people like Ms. Davis and more people like a Mr. Jacob, maybe that's how we can change the system. Maybe it doesn't come from the top, but it comes from people like you all.
Absolutely.
So in the last 3 minutes, and I know I took one of them, talk about how we can inspire that kind of activism.
Thank you, and you shared some of it already. I landed, perchance, at Sousa Middle School in D.C. as one of the schools, which was the subject of Brown v. Board, one of the 5 corresponding cases. I didn't know it. After 3 years of being there, I was informed. And I used that as a platform for changing conditions at that school and in that community. And on the 50th anniversary of Brown, because my students knew so much about the case, the bowling case, they used it to redesign their own school. They were invited to Capitol Hill by Senators Kennedy and Pelosi to talk about the bowling case. And what they were surprised to hear was 6th and 7th grade kids talking about the fact that there was really no need to commemorate or celebrate Brown when they were in a school that was de facto segregated, resegregated, that basically was in the same deplorable conditions as schools in 1953. The landmark. Of course, we were on C-SPAN. I was transferred again as a result of that. But the lesson that I learned was the students, the lesson that they gained from that actually empowered me as a teacher. Using our platforms wherever we are, use our platforms to advocate for change at all times, equity. And right now, collaboration with DC Public Schools is the best opportunity we have. With the chancellor who just stepped down and the one that is coming in, I have a meeting with her tomorrow to ensure that the initiatives that were put forth by Chancellor Wilson, who I thought, in my opinion, would have made a vast difference in DC Public Schools. Thank you, and we would not have had additional instability that this churn of teachers and administrators are having. So advocating in a strong way for things that need to change, not being afraid to advocate and say, this is something the chancellor should have had, and of course I've expressed it to the mayor, put in their contract the ability to put their kids in any school they want to avoid a misstep like that he made. But amplifying the voice of teachers is one of the most significant goals that we have as a union, because teachers, those working in the classroom closest to students every day, understand how they learn, when they learn, the different ways in which they learn, and what resources they need in order to learn. But they will also identify the inequities that still exist in their schools, and particularly in those schools where teachers are serving the most underserved students in the city. So we've got to use our platforms from wherever we are. And of course, I want you to please let Secretary DeVos know that I was looking forward to meeting her. And hopefully she will be able to visit other schools in DC as well. And I look forward to hosting her at that. So hopefully I addressed some of the questions or the question you asked.
You did. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to our esteemed panelists from this session and the session before. Give them one last round of applause. And thank you to Centaurus for bringing us together. And I'll turn it over to Liv.
And before the panelists leave, we're going to have, because we didn't have a chance to have a Q&A session the last round. And we believe that dialogue is critical. So we're going to allow the audience to engage our speakers, both those in this panel as well as those in the previous panel who are still with us. But before we do so, we've been joined, and we're honored to be joined by the leading regulator for the telecom, energy, infrastructure here in the District of Columbia. And that is none other than the chair of the District of Columbia's Public Service Commission, which is the oldest government institution that is here in Washington, D.C. for the local community. It was the first government agency to provide services to the people of who live within the contours of Washington, D.C. So without any further ado, let us put our hands together to the chair of the District of Columbia's Public Service Commission, the former member of the D.C. City Council, now the chairwoman of the D.C. Public Service Commissioner, Chairman Betty Ann Kane.
Thank you very much. And appreciate the opportunity to be here. I was not here earlier because we had to be down before the City Council for our annual performance review of the Public Service Commission. Every agency in the district government gets the pleasure of having that done to them every year. But I was thinking there as I was being asked questions. Councilmember McDuffie, one of the first questions he asked me was, he was looking at our report that showed we had some vacancies in the commission staff. And he said, how are you going about filling them? Well, we had a position for an administrative assistant, a kind of clerk job. We had 79 applicants. We were right on point for filling that. We have an application, a vacancy for an accountant, one of the young accountants that we hired. His wife, Mr. Family, back in California, so he left last month and is going back there, get a job with the utility there. But we had a whole string of applicants already for that position. And then he pointed to our vacancy on a gas engineer, and a vacancy for a electric engineer, and a vacancy for the head of our Office of Infrastructure Systems and Planning. And I said, I don't know when we're going to be able to fill those. There is a challenge, so we prefer to hire DC residents, but we have a great challenge in finding gas engineers, civil engineers, electrical engineers, and people who look beyond just the sort of nuts and bolts of engineering, but look into planning, look into infrastructure. And I thought that's a message that resonates obviously with what we're all talking about here today. So that, and I know our utilities have that same challenge. So the work that you're doing, and I would applaud Elizabeth Davis in particular, 44 years at DC Public Schools. I remember Carl Hansen. I went on my first elected office, my first public service in the district was a member of the school board, which I was elected to in '74, a little bit after Carl Hansen. But Barbara Sizemore was superintendent at that time and lived through a number of superintendents. My daughter is a graduate of Banneker High School, the first city high school. But we need more of that, and it's very, in a way, very encouraging to know that people like Ms. Davis are still there struggling and pushing it. But it's also discouraging to know that some of the problems that I saw when I went on the school board in 1974 as the parent of elementary school children, that some of those disparities and inequities, in spite of our citywide high schools like Banneker, like Phelps, like all of the charter schools that we have and the choices people have, that some of those challenges and inequities are still there. So I applaud you for, and let me tell you, one of the things I did in between leaving the council and my present position was I was executive director of the DC Retirement Board.
Oh,
so
wow.
whenever you retire after 44 years, there's still good money there in the pension fund for that. But very briefly, I know Dan Cleverton and my staff, you guys have talked about some of the projects that we have. One of the things I checked that he did not mention is that as a result of one of the conditions, when the commission approved the merger or the purchase of TEPCO by Exelon, the national Chicago company, was $2 million was put aside, donation from Exelon to set up employment for utility work. And our mayor, Mayor Dowser, has taken that money and using it to set up an infrastructure academy, a DC infrastructure academy, which will be aimed at training people, and DC residents only, for the good paying jobs that are there in the utilities. Pepco has put in some more money. Washington Gas has put in some more money. There's going to be more money from the taxpayers into that. And that infrastructure academy, I believe, is set to open next year. But it's aimed at post-high school adults and getting ready to be able to go into those jobs. So that is at least one small step that's being taken, because the jobs are changing, and it is the math, it is the skills, it is the technology, the automation. You still need people who are going to do the building, who are going to have the hands-on work. We just opened a new substation, Pepco did, down at Southwest Waterfront, a very large substation there. It took a lot of people to build that. It's a whole block square. So there were a lot of jobs when it was being constructed, and technical jobs. It's very high tech. But you go in it now, and it runs 24/7, and there are like 4 people running it. And sometimes there's nobody there at all, because it's all by computers, and it's all back to a central control. So the skills that are needed to do that part of the utility work is something that's very, very important too. So I won't take any more time except to say that we applaud what you're doing. Anything that we can help encourage young people, and particularly young people, to go into, to look at science, to look at math, to look at engineering, to look at technology. is something that I think is very important. I wanted to be an architect when I was in high school. And I was in high school way back, way back. I was in love with Frank Lloyd Wright and the idea of designing and all of that. And my guidance counselor said to me, this was 1958, as I was looking to go to college. She said, girls don't become architects. You'd have to study engineering, and you couldn't do that. You could become an interior decorator, she said, go to design school.
This was a woman telling me that.
And I guess I believed her. I didn't do that well in physics, but I wasn't encouraged either, so I believed her. And I majored in English, became a teacher, a very important profession also. But and those things are still there. I think if you look at, I don't know how many young ladies are there at Phelps?
I would imagine over 50% of the
Over
girls.
50%?
You're right, but the courses that they're directed into is.
Yeah, they're not into that's
Yeah.
right. So we have a lot of work to do.
Yes.
A lot of work to do together. And so I applaud all you're doing, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll bring this chair over here
Okay.
for you, Chair. And you can have a seat next to our other distinguished guests. So the floor is open. If there are any questions that you guys might have, and I'll maybe start, particularly with respect to some of the monies that are out there and then perhaps being leveraged, hopefully in future budgets. What do you see as the opportunities for us to tie in some of the great work? We've talked to Dr. Wooten about an initiative to get partners from the Department of Defense as well as the Department of Homeland Security to fund and channel the pluses in their budgets to fund perhaps a grant that could be administered at the Department of Education to build cybersecurity, data analytics, and artificial intelligence labs, perhaps at the District of Columbia's community college, as well as other community colleges across the country, in addition to historically black colleges and universities such as Lincoln University. Do you all think that this might be the type of formula that can be replicated to make sure that education continues to grow in terms of educational funding continues to grow, as opposed to being stymied by the cuts that some have offered? Anybody can answer that question.
Well, since you referenced the conversation that you and I were having actually before the panel convened, I think it would be appropriate to kind of share a few of the details and connect some of the dots for everyone. So you had mentioned a partnership with DHS, or Department of Homeland Security, and DOD. And one of the things I mentioned is, and I'll spell out a little bit more detail. There is a shift in budget priorities where there will be less money in non-defense areas and more money in defense areas. And I'm repeatedly telling folks that doesn't mean the money went away. It went from this pot to that pot. And what I mentioned to him is, you're one of the first people I knew who figured out the money's over here, go over here after those opportunities. I'm talking to major businesses who are saying, we are struggling to harvest the skills that we need to support our digital requirements. We have contracts, but we have lots of government contracts, but we can't get people in who have the skills necessary for the digital work that we're doing, let alone go through the arduous security background checks. Now, I will tell you something else, and I'll tell you something else that they probably wouldn't like for me to mention, and that is there are even more opportunities than those. And they don't require those arduous background checks, and they'll pay more. And they're finding that Apple and Amazon are stealing a lot of that talent away from them. They're competing for the same folks. So the work is there. The opportunities can be created, and you were talking about a way to do that. But the challenge is making sure, connecting the dots, and making sure that the people that Ms. Davis serves are able to seize those opportunities, are able to connect those opportunities, and made aware of those opportunities, because if those conditions are met, they can fulfill those opportunities. So I think that's one of the things that I want to make sure we were pretty
Thank you
clear
for that
on.
additional background. And let me bring in Ms. Davis and even perhaps our colleague from Lincoln University along with the chair. I mean, do you think that the type of partnerships that were alluded to, perhaps, between, let's say, middle school and high schools in partnership with, community colleges and HBCUs, working with our, again, regulated companies, are the way, kind of these labs, be they infrastructure academies or cybersecurity labs, but these where they're not just one institution being involved in the training, but multiple educational institutions tying in to the business community. I mean, do you think that also is an adequate platform?
Absolutely.
Creative, if you will?
Without the partnerships, we are just talking in the wind. And one of the problems that we're having now is the fact that those partnerships have not existed to help connect the dots between schools and businesses, schools and entrepreneurship, schools and partners. We've got to do it. And it's no way we can possibly have a well-rounded STEM program, national program, that is effective for all students, irrespective of their zip code, where they come from, if we do not have those partnerships. Because as you can see, having the information amongst the individuals in this room means nothing if the youth or the people that need the jobs, need the training, need the infrastructure academy that I'm hoping that we can hear more about, because that is what excites me. I'm solution driven. I'm not interested in continuing conversations that we've had for 20 years with no solution. I'm looking for identifying why isn't it happening for all children who want jobs. And I know that the youth that I see on the streets of DC do not all want to be on the streets of DC.
That's right.
And we've got to create the access and opportunity for those students to say, here's a pipeline, a pathway for me to go from here to there.
Dr. Sutton?
Yeah, and I would probably say that the partnerships are absolutely critical.
Yes.
I mean, and that's one of the things, and that's one of the directions in which we're moving. I think that in my presentation I mentioned, the ability and the emphasis when it comes to our students to do undergraduate research and internships, because we know that these public-private partnerships are really the way to go, and that's what we're trying to do. And I think that even when I talked a little bit about the algebra project, for example, these are the types of partnerships in that algebra project with Dave Dennis and Bob Moses. Yes. That we're putting together. And there's actually under a grant, I believe that Virginia State University is the lead on this grant. It's Lincoln, Virginia State, Dillard, and another HBCU, where we're partnering with Bob Moses and Dave Dennis, working with teachers, in different communities, Philadelphia and some of the other communities associated with this project, teaching them different ways to teach, algebra and science and math as a way of, sort of having like a pipeline, if you will, of students coming into STEM professions. So it's absolutely critical that we have these kind of partnerships.
Yeah.
Excellent. Chair?
Yeah, I was going to say the infrastructure project, Infrastructure Academy is under the district's Department of Employment Services, and it is employer-driven. It is Washington Gas, it's DC Water also, and PEPCO in particular that are driving they have the same problem that we face in finding employees. So I think that kind of employer-driven, employer-defined, industry-defined training programs are essential.
Right. You're right.
And that, there are jobs there. There were 5,000 infrastructure jobs available in the district last year, I believe, if I recall the figures right from the mayor, and over half of them went unfilled. I mean, not even filled with people from out of state, but just unfilled.
Let us, again, put our hands together for our outstanding panel. I also mentioned a couple of acknowledgments that we would be remiss if we didn't mention. None other than NASDAQ, the Washington Teachers Union, and Lincoln University. Let's give another round of applause to them. In addition, this conversation was made possible by the outstanding work of Dr. Leonard Haynes, the advisor to Secretary Betsy DeVos, David Byrd, advisor to HUD Secretary Dr. Ben Carson, Dr. Patricia Ramsey, provost of Lincoln University, David Owens, the Edison Electric Institute Executive Vice President Emeritus, who echoed what was stated that the schools don't have people who are current, who are actually in the business of protecting our in the business of monitoring our networks. So again, the knowledge that even some of the outstanding professionals who are in those schools is somewhat dated. So it's critical to create these partnerships that you're talking about. And again, David Owens would be happy that his remarks were reflected. Angela Trapp and Oliver Washington and Derek Allen. I also want to recognize Cynthia Ward, Ann McClarty Jackson, Emil Bryant, and Brendan Nichols, along with Chris, our outstanding director of photography, and also let's put our hands together for them as well. We also have another, again, so we have a video photographer and then a still photographer. Let's put our hands together for our still photographer as well. He's available also to network with. Let me just, before we dismiss you all, give you a heads up on what some other things are coming up for Sim for Us. So we're working, we're going to be on the road, heading to South by Southwest in Austin, Texas, to talk about the need to have more diverse voices being involved in the education, particularly of students of color across the country, focusing on artificial intelligence, data analytics, and cybersecurity. And so that's going to be taking place at the beginning of March. And then at the end of March, we have another conversation talking about the need for more diverse advisors to members of the Senate and members of the United States House of Representatives, recognizing that if we can create a pipeline of diverse advisors, then they can be, as Dr. Wooten was mentioned, they can be recruited by Microsoft and Apple's and Airbnb. And so then therefore, those tech companies who say that we can't find diverse people to fill these jobs won't have any excuse, because they would have been, again, involved with advising on a tech policy level members of Congress. And so clearly they would be well prepared for those jobs. We look forward to also sitting down with the Public Service Commission. We talked about last year providing a pipeline of people who can be interns for the summer, and so that you won't have the problem of not having an infrastructure director or an engineering director or a architectural director or other types of high technology-related science directors in your team. So we look forward to working with you, and also every one of you all on this table, and those who were at the other panel. So again, let us leave here. One other point I want to make sure that we leave here. Let us leave here also with the thought that we as a society are in a strange time. We're in a strange time, and one of the curious characteristics that I find is this thought about, on the one hand, wanting to invest in training and wanting to invest in our young people, but then on the other hand, sending a message that by people making mistakes, such as the mistake that was apparently made by our chancellor, that these people can be discarded. And to me, I think that that is a fundamental problem. And I think that some people who are in tech policy are actually creating those types of thinking into their analysis about workers. Meaning to say, as was discussed before, with the creation and the advent of artificial intelligence, you can essentially replace human workers with robots. And so as we leave, particularly those of you all who are in policy positions, let me encourage you to build in to systems that you are creating human redundancy. Because if you don't build in human redundancy, you yourself may be put out of a job or put out of utility. And again, we've seen some of the dystopic films that have come out when humans no longer become useful. What happens to those? And clearly those are, supposedly science fiction, but, perhaps this can become reality. And so I don't want that type of reality where humans are no longer needed. But in order for that to occur, we have to get out of this mindset that people can be discarded. One of the beautiful things that I've always taught my children is that a mistake actually helps set you up for a success. That you cannot become successful if you don't make mistakes. And if we communicate, again, to them that if they make a mistake, they will be basically discarded, then we are, again, eliminating also another characteristic of humanity, and that is innovation and ingenuity. And ingenuity cannot exist without trial and error.
Thank
as
you.
an engineer. So again, I want to leave you all with that, and I look forward to, again, continuing to engage with you all throughout the rest of the year. Again, let's put our hands together for ourselves for making it out, and we look forward to it. Thank you very much.